Hey guys, Zach Hartzlatter here. First of all, thank you so much for joining me on a Sunday afternoon for another rambling video. Today we are addressing something that was asked to me in the comment sections of one of my previous videos, which brings me to my first point. If you have an idea for a rambling video, please include it down in the comments because there's, if it's interesting, there's a pretty decent chance that I might make a video on it, and I know that's fun for everyone. So today's comment comes from Darkblade950, and I'm just going to read what he wrote and then we'll talk about it. I have a request for you. If you may. Could you do a rambling video like this on the expanded universe movement? Not to hate on it or praise it, just your opinion on the notion of legends being continued alongside current canon. It's a touchy subject as you'll have to talk about how convoluted and stupid the expanded universe was, but then you got people who praise legends and feel heavily disenfranchised with the decision to discontinue it. It'd be interesting to hear your insights on the subject. Well, I'm not sure if I have any insights more than, the average hardcore Star Wars fan, but I do obviously have some opinions on it, and some of you guys might not even know. Sorry, I just sat down. Hopefully I didn't screw the mic up too much. Some of you guys might not know what Legends is, or what the difference between Legends and canon is, or even what canon is. So I'm going to explain that first, and if you guys already know, you can skip ahead a little bit. But canon is essentially everything. When someone says, is this canon or not, it means, is it official within the Star Wars story? So, for example, Darth Vader being Luke's father is canon. Any fan fiction, anything created by a fan is not canon. Right now, what is Legends is not canon. We'll get to that in just a second. So right now, within the Star Wars universe, I'll explain what is canon. So obviously the 7 main movies are canon. Any video games that have come out since Disney purchased Lucasfilm are considered canon. So there's several mobile games, and I think really Star Wars Battlefront is the only main AAA game that's come out, but those are all canon, as are, I don't know if I said Rebels already, but the 2007 Clone Wars TV show, but not the earlier one. So those are all considered officially part of the Star Wars universe. Also, any trading card games that have come out since Disney purchased Lucasfilm, any tabletop games, any guides that are created, things like that. So obviously, so Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012, I think, maybe 2014, I can't remember exactly, but obviously Star Wars has been around since 1979, and in some versions a little bit earlier with like the novelization. So there are 35 years of things that came out before that, and before, again, the purchase, and this is really the important part, is Disney purchased Lucasfilm and everything changed. So let's just go back to before the purchase. There were obviously the 6 Star Wars movies. There were several Star Wars TV shows. So there was the old Clone Wars TV show, which had been completed, and there was one being worked on and being aired. And then there were older TV shows like the Ewok shows and the droid shows. And then, of course, probably the largest part of the expanded universe was the multitude of books, video games, comics, like I said, tabletop games, card games. All of those things were part of the Star Wars universe at that point. And usually you'd call them the expanded universe. So the movies would be, I guess, the main portion of Star Wars, and everything else would be the expanded universe. And there were some issues with the expanded universe, which I'll get into at just a second. Some of them are subjective and some of them are objective. But yeah, that was the Star Wars expanded universe. So, and it was all canon at the time. Sometimes things would be treated as a lesser level of canon, which is kind of weird, but it was all technically canon. All officially part of the Star Wars universe. So, Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2 was part of the Star Wars universe, and the story that was told in there was officially part of the Star Wars mythos, the overall overarching story. So then Disney bought out Lucasfilm, and they bought Star Wars as a brand, and obviously they wanted to go in their own direction in some respects, so they made everything that came before it, all parts of the expanded universe, excluding, as I said, the Star Wars Clone Wars TV show. They made that all what is called Legends. And that basically means that it's an alternate history. It's like another dimension within the Star Wars universe. It's no longer canon. It's pretty much the same level as fan fiction, to be honest, because what they do is they'll draw from it. So for example, there are plenty of things that first appeared in Star Wars Legends, which, after Disney purchased them were no longer canon, but which Disney adopted. So probably the most famous example would be Grand Admiral Thrawn. He started out, obviously, at the purchase non-canon because he doesn't appear in any of the movies or the Clone Wars TV show, but Star Wars incorporated him through Rebels and through his own novel. So obviously this left a lot of fans really unhappy, because a lot of us grew up on that sort of stuff. Like, I grew up reading the books and playing the video games, and I mean, I still do. So it kind of sucks to see part of your childhood no longer being continued, and more than that, kind of given like an asterisk next to it. So yeah, it kind of sucks. But let's first talk about Disney's decision to do that, because I understand why they made it non-canon. I mean, the expanded universe was kind of created with the thought that there were never going to be any, like in Episode 7. You know, the Star Wars universe in the expanded universe went from, you know, a millennia before the movies to 137 years, I think, after the Battle of Yavin. So all the stories that could have been told, not all of them, but, you know, the fate of the characters is kind of sealed. So if Disney wanted to make an Episode 7 while still keeping the expanded universe canon, they would have had to tell a story that had already been told. And they would have been locked in and confined to, you know, telling a certain story. And that's why I don't really understand when people say, like, fuck Disney or whatever. Because obviously they're not going to tell us stories that we've already been told. So when they wiped the canon, they had full freedom to make the movie that they wanted with the plot that they wanted. However, another thing that they've done is stop making new Star Wars Legends content. So one of the options that would have been available to them is to make new canon Star Wars content and then continue to make Legends Star Wars content, which, you know, it would have made sense, but it may have been confusing to the consumer. On some respects, because, you know, especially say like you're a parent going out to buy a new book for your kid and you see Star Wars Legends and Star Wars canon, like what, you don't know what to buy. It doesn't mean anything to you. It only really means something to people who are, you know, deeply ingrained in Star Wars. However, on the other hand, the expanded universe was incredibly rich, and there were definitely some crappy parts of the expanded universe, which I'm going to get to in just a second. But I mean, 40 years almost worth of material, you know, whether it's the backstories that started coming out in the 70s to, you know, the books at the end of the expanded universe taking place hundreds of years after the Battle of Yavin. There was so much there and so much really, really good content. One thing people complain about all the time, and I think validly, is that, you know, there wasn't enough oversight over the expanded universe. It's kind of the opposite. Right now, Disney is heavily curating the material that becomes officially part of Star Wars canon, probably because they've seen what could happen to the expanded universe if it was left, you know, there wasn't a careful, watchful eye over it. I mean, there were some stories that really divided fans, like the other video I mentioned, Waru. He was a character in that story, was one, the Crystal Star, I believe it's called, was one that really heavily divided Star Wars fans. And there were some other real duds, and like some of the characters were probably too overexplored. Like people complain about Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba appearing in Rogue One. Well, that is like small potatoes compared to some of the things the expanded universe did. And I'm just trying to, like, so many connections there. And just, yeah, there were some really bad stories. I know a lot of people, one that really kind of divides people is the Yuzhang Vong. I've never really been sure how I feel about it. I like the idea of, you know, invaders from another galaxy, and I like the idea of there being other galaxies within the Star Wars universe. I actually love that idea. But the whole not being, being disconnected from the Force, I don't really like that. So that was just one of the stories. I mean, once, especially when it got kind of, you know, after Luke and the main crew were dead, a lot of people kind of had problems with how the story went there. And people also, I think, kind of falsely look at things that were part of the expanded universe but were never really, even at the time, considered canon. I can't remember if I mentioned Skippy the Jedi droid yet, but that's one example. And for that, it's basically the droid who's being sold along with R2-D2 and C-3PO, and who gets chosen before R2-D2, but has his motivator explode. There's basically a kind of a funny little backstory, never canon, but that he was a Jedi and he sensed that for the greater good, R2-D2 had to go and with Luke, so he exploded. So that's just like one of the stories, but that was, for example, never considered part of canon. But, you know, things like the Ewok TV show were at least considered partial canon, and that brings me to another point I'm going to get into in just a second. They were considered partial canon, and they were obviously meant for children. You know, at times, the Star Wars official magazine would have fan submissions, and the best one would get chosen as part of the official canon. And then there were weird stories like, IG-88 being uploaded to the Death Star and trying to take control of it and initiate a droid revolution, just things like that, which were weird and, sometimes didn't make sense. And people complain about like Abeloth and stuff, but a lot of that is being carried over to the new canon anyway. Another problem with the canon was that it had various levels of canonicity. I don't know if that's a real word, but like various levels of how canon something was. So there was like G canon, I think was the term, which was like George Lucas canon, so like the movies. Splinter of a Mind's Eye, I think, might have been considered that as well, because it was the official draft for a book, had episode 4 and up been successful. So things like that were high level canon, and then there were various steps, but in practicality, these were all kind of treated the same way. And people also point to bad stories like, Palpatine coming back to life in the Dark Empire comics, and Palpatine having a son with 3 eyes. It's a little silly. Luke turning to the dark side, again in that Dark Empire comic. Like, a lot of that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not necessarily good, like some of it's just not good storytelling, and that's my subjective opinion. The objective point that I mentioned earlier was that oftentimes there wasn't a whole lot of supervision. There were contradictions, lack of cohesiveness. That was all a problem. But on the other hand, the canon was the expanded universe was very well expanded, and there were lots of really great stories. So, for example, Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, and especially 1, were both stories that were amazing and are great as part of the Star Wars universe, but they just got wiped away. Totally wiped away. Now, Disney can choose to reintroduce them as they did with Thrawn, who is obviously another really great character, but, some of my favorite stories, really some of my favorite Star Wars content, all in all, is from the expanded universe. So things like Thrawn and the Outbound Flight, and I like kind of some of the stories where they're training as Jedi, Jaina and Jason. I like all of those stories, and they just got wiped away, and now, they're obviously non-canon. Some of them have been specifically countered by new stuff. So, Solo and Leia, how their life turned out is now completely at odds with the current canon. Again, that's completely fine, but it just sucks to see some of those stories, Timothy Zahn wrote so much good stuff, so many good books, so many good stories, and again, they wiped it clean. And the argument that they can pull from the old canon it is good, and I assume that Knights of the Old Republic will be recanonized, at least in some form, which kind of brings me to one of the other issues I didn't mention. The power level of some of the characters was a little silly, for example, Palpatine having his Force storms and some of the things Luke did. That was a little silly, I understand, but going back to what is good about canon, or the expanded universe, you had so many ship designs, the Eclipse, for example, one of the coolest Superstar Destroyers is gone, and so many of the the TIE Fighter variants, and things like that. Again, it can all be taken back. But how do I feel about the canon and the Legends operating concurrently? Well, there's so many mysteries left in Legends, so many stories that have been alluded to but not quite told. We learn about mysteries of the unknown regions, I mentioned in one of my other videos, the Nal Nal, the interdimensional plague, the Flood, who take over people, and how they may have been connected to the hyperspace anomaly at the edge of the galaxy. So stuff like that is really interesting. So for example, I also mentioned in my previous video that there's 8 other galaxies within the Star Wars universe, and I think as a joke, one was including the own, but really there's 7 galaxies near the Star Wars galaxy is what I meant to say. So, what's going on with those galaxies? Will we ever learn a little bit more about them? And then there's the 2 galaxies that are really close that we know a little bit about, Fire Fist and the Rishi Maze. I would love to hear more stories about the weird things that are going on there. I mean, the Star Wars galaxy is one that has probably a quintillion people in it. There's so many little stories, and there's such a rich, background already of all these characters that are, mentioned in one book, and then they'll throw them in another book, and then eventually, a real overarching story starts to come together, and that's despite the fact that there's sometimes not enough editorial guidance. And all that's gone now. And I mean, you can introduce a character, you can introduce, for example, what they did in Rogue One. They kind of alluded to Dr. Evazan being the mad surgeon, like he was back in the day. you can introduce that, but you can't introduce all the little things that made that kind of interesting, you know? Like, you can't, unless you choose to reintroduce whole books, you can't reintroduce, for example, one of my favorite Legends book is one of the silliest ones, and I said it's the only one that I have with me right now in a hard copy of my new place. It's the Cantina Book. I forget the initial, Tales from the Cantina. And, you know, it details, you know, pretty much every person within the cantina. It gives them a really fun little backstory, which is completely inconsequential to the major Star Wars universe. So, like, for example, it tells the story of Figdit and Dan and the Modal Nodes, the Bith band that plays at the cantina. It tells, like, how they got the job, what they'd done previously, who they'd run into, and there's no reason for Disney to ever bring that back into canon, you know? There's no reason for that story to ever matter again. Which sucks, because it means that they'll never bring it back, because they'll probably never look at that book and be like, let's make this canon again, because already it would probably interfere with some of the stuff we got in Rogue One with Dr. Evazan and Ponto Baba. So that sucks. It sucks that richness and that universe, because it's really like we're losing, you know, the Star Wars universe. We're getting a new one that I like a lot, but we've seen an end to the Star Wars universe. The Legends universe anyways, because no new material is coming out. At least that's what it appears like anyways. Another thing is that there is still a lot of time left. Like, I think there's a pretty big time jump. I think it goes from about 40 years after the Battle of Yavin to 130 with the end, with the ending books. And we don't really know how Luke dies, how Han dies. We don't know a lot of that stuff, which brings me back to another controversial moment. I remember when Chewbacca died, when the moon fell on him. That was a really big controversial moment among Star Wars fans. But yeah, so we don't know how Legends Luke Skywalker died. I mean, he became one with the Force, obviously, when he was very old, most likely, because who can kill him? But like Han Solo, Princess Leia, we don't know what happened to all of those people. There's a lot of story left to be told there, you know? Like, I do understand the argument that it's too confusing and it's too much work to have two ongoing universes, and it kind of makes it more like, you know, a Marvel kind of comic thing where there's a multiverse and stuff like that. But I do wish, I completely 100% understand. I'm going to answer this question right now. Completely understand where the Legends continuation people are coming from. 100%. Completely understand. And they've got a great point, because there are mysteries from Star Wars Legends that I will never see answered. And I find that kind of upsetting, and, you know, maybe there will never be another Outbound Flight book. I liked things like the Outbound Flight. I liked the Unknown Regions. I liked the Ancient Jedi. I liked all of that being part of the Star Wars universe because it made it richer for me, you know. I didn't necessarily like a lot of parts of Legends being part of the universe, but, you know, at one point we kind of got to have our cake and eat it too. And I think if another thing, I guess, too, which I'm just kind of thinking about now as I'm rambling, is that should Disney allow the Legends material to continue being made, there will always be negative comments about what Disney is doing and how the Legends people have it so much better. I mean, we already see that now. Every time a new movie comes out, people will say, oh, why didn't they just keep it how it was? Like, I liked Anakin Solo better than Ben Solo, like things like that. So I can understand how you don't want to really compete with your own brand. Now, like, when I think about it, that makes a lot of sense. So if I were in Disney shoes, I'm not going to say that I would do something different, because I might. But as a fan, I mean, because I might not. I might do what they did and get rid of Legends, or move the expanded universe to Legends, and I would understand that. You also don't want to have your comics literally selling against other comics. So, like, you don't want to have a Han Solo canon comic selling against a Han Solo Legends comic. It makes a ton of sense. But I mean, on the other hand, that's worked out for comic books for a long time. So, I don't know. They want to build their own expanded universe. I understand. Because, I mean, Star Wars is probably going to be around for another 40 years. And in 40 years, the new expanded universe will be incredibly deep. Very, very deep. Hopefully in a good way. I like the direction it's going now. There's 30 years, though, between The Force Awakens and Return of the Jedi, which hasn't been fleshed out enough yet. And I'd really like to see how they do that, because that's really where, like, most of the fun Legend stories came from, that 30 years. Or way, way before the movies. That time all still exists. So I really hope they do their best. Like, if I were a Disney executive in control of Star Wars, if I were like Pablo or maybe Kathleen Kennedy, I guess she's more Lucasfilm, but the first thing I would want to start doing is to start reincorporating elements from Knights of the Old Republic. I would be like, let's get a remake on the go right now so that those stories will be canon again. And then I would start, bringing back some of those old Sith books and some of those old Jedi books, and I'd really start from there. And then I would, look at the stories from between Return of the Jedi and the end of Legends, which really worked well within those 30 years after the Battle of Yavin. And I really started incorporating those too. And they've started to do something similar with Thrawn, but I wouldn't bring the Yuzhang Vong back, for those wondering. I would not bring them back. I understand the appeal of them, and they're not awful, but I think it's too much. It's like a hard reset of the Star Wars universe when they came in. Don't really like that. I'd also try to keep I guess one thing Legends didn't do is it made who the good guys were always very confusing. Like at one point, the Galactic Alliance was bad. When Darth Caedus was ruling it, the name changes from the New Republic to there's so much. There's too much. Try to keep that all pretty similar, but they're already kind of failing at that with the difference between the New Republic and the Resistance. And this video is going pretty long, I think, so I'm going to end it in just a second. But to answer the question definitively, yes, I understand the point of the Legends people who want the Legends to continue. I do too, but I see Disney's point, and part of me is kind of happy that I don't have to read people arguing on the internet about if the newest Legends story or if the new canon story is better. But I think that is going to happen regardless. So guys, thank you so much for listening to this video. If you've gotten all this way, I think we must be over 20 minutes by now. If you have gotten to the end of this video, let me know down in the comments what your favorite Legend story is and why. Tell me your favorite scene within the story too. So your favorite Legend story and your favorite scene. I'm trying to think of mine. I think Knights of the Old Republic is probably my favorite Legend story. And I think my favorite scene would have to be, well, the big revelation. I won't spoil it. That's all really good. So, yeah, let me know down in the comments, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching. Again, if you made it through the end of this video, I really, really appreciate it. But I'll talk to you guys later. May the Force be with you.